Let's talk about change. Probably the most simplistic model out there is Lewin's change model. Unfreeze the organization. Change, 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 change. Refreeze the organization. It's kind of simplistic. There's a lot of different things involved with change and what it means. One example is if you want to really change your organization, change the technology. Nobody squeaks about it, but change this vice president to do this department and this department. Everybody wants to gossip and everything else in the process. Working in human resources over the years, it was always interesting that whenever the person next to me, the vice chancellor of business services, wanted to do something, they could spend $3 or $4 million and the board of trustees would never be the least bit concerned. Soon as I hired somebody to work part-time, 19 and a half hours a week, that was the niece of so-and-so and everything else, everybody had to scrutinize, make certain I was doing the right thing. It's interesting what's different out there. If you make a change in the money or the fiscal structure, it's fine. If you hire somebody that may be questionable over there, or yes, you have that. So some issues on the change really have flares go up in the process. So watch what you're changing. Sometimes there are different ways of doing it, but for the most part, you're going to unfreeze the organization. You're going to make the changes and then lock things back in. Ideally, if you're going to look at change, you want to sit down and look at benchmarks. Now, benchmark literally, it's a matter of you look across your entire industry and say, this organization has the best process. We're going to follow this organization and do this. And you want to compare yourself to it. And maybe you are the benchmark. So you want to look at that. You want to compare the best practices in your industry and then use that as your standard that you want to do it. You want to focus in on your core competencies, making certain that you do this well, kind of like Nike. Nike does great shoe design, period. That's what they do. Their advertising, I'm not too fond of it sometimes. I think they're too edgy, my opinion. I don't like some of the things they do, except for the fact that they still make great shoes. They still have advertising that draws the people's attention to them, but they farm out everything else because they don't make the shoes. They don't make the soles. Somebody else does. And if they don't like it, they fire them and hire somebody else to do it. So they have their core competencies and they know what those core competencies are. You should know what your core competencies are. And if you have a failing in another area, maybe you need to jettison that, farm it out, and have somebody do that for you so you can focus in as to what you're out there. A lot of times, you'll have customer support and sales outsourced by somebody. You'll have information, your IT department outsourced. You'll have HR outsourced. You'll have your custodial services outsourced. You'll have manufacturing, have somebody else do that for you. It just depends what you're doing. So change isn't easy. Employees like to do the things the way they always have. Sometimes you just have to sit down and bring change in and do a lot of talking because one of the cores of trying to bring change about is talking to people what it is. A lot of times when you talk to them, you want to sit down and find out what they think needs to be changed. And sometimes you need to stop talking, listen to them, and have them provide input. Now, if you have a group decision, if you have a group of people all saying, here it is, and you get them together and say, here's why I think change is necessary, and you get people going back and forth, and you get them all to agree and adopt some of their ideas, what they felt needs to be changed. All of a sudden now, instead of you being the visionary for the change, you might have 15 people be the visionary for the change and cooperating to bring your ideas and change forward. But you have to sit down and be flexible and listen to them because sometimes your group decision is often much better than that of an individual. So sometimes you need to get rid of some of the old, bring in some of the new. A lot of times people have different skill sets based upon generational aspects as to what they've always done. And sometimes they think it's too simplistic in the process and don't understand human nature. So always make certain you have a balanced aspect of it. When you restructure, you want to sit down and make it more efficient and more effective to serve customers. Sometimes people don't agree with what your thoughts are in the process. So it takes time other than it needs to be done. No, you don't do change for the sake of change. You do stake for the sake of trying to improve overall the effectiveness of your organization, reduce costs, but above all, making sure your customer benefits from it. Sometimes you have different structures. Once upon a time, Zappos shoes had this bizarre structure where they didn't have anybody in charge. And one of the questions they would ask for the interview, if you were going to organize a parade to celebrate a new model for Zappos shoes, how would you organize it? That was actually a question for a candidate for a low-level job in the organization. But wait a minute, there were no levels. They had this strange circular organization, they called it. Sometimes you have an inverted organization where you sit down and have really the workers are on top and the supervisors are supporting the workers. That is actually the model for Nordstrom. Nordstrom, once upon a time, celebrated the aspect of an employee that gave a return for something that was never sold by Nordstrom. Somebody came into their Troy store in Troy, Michigan, and they says, I bought these shoes here 11 years ago. They're a pair of boots, field boots, and I bought them here. And it's 11 years ago, and they failed, and I have a lifetime warranty. Well, Nordstrom's never once sold that brand of boot, never once at all, ever. And the person went on, and finally the person says, okay. And the person gave him a full refund without a receipt for whatever he said. And that happened. 3 days later, that person came back in. They took the credit that sales clerk had given him, spent that and $300 more, a total sale of $400, and all of a sudden now it became part of the corporate story because she sat down there and saw the need. And by the time it was all done, she got a super loyal customer that spread the word about the brand of boots that they never once sold because she took care of that customer's need. And it really was a matter of the top management supported her because of the fact she made a decision that supported the philosophy of the overall store. That's kind of the coolest way to possibly do it. By the way, Nordstrom also is a high-end retailer, but that being said, that works and it gives a good illustration as to what an inverted structure really is. Cultures sometimes they have a hard time adapting to change. You really want to cut into the culture itself and look at what the culture is, because sometimes if you violate the culture will come back and kill you in the process and get you fired and out the door. One time I worked in an organization and we had a new chancellor, and she's David, this culture is rotten right to the core. And so she's talking to me and everything else, and I'm listening to her. I said, but the problem is that culture is going to fight back as soon as you try to change it. Sure enough, 18 months later, I'm sitting in a boardroom, and there's my chancellor sitting there at the board meeting, and the board chair is hammering away with their gavel saying, out of order, out of order. And they fired her and they brought the old culture back in. Sometimes you fight the culture, and the culture will eat you and it'll eat your lunch if you aren't careful. So be careful on that. The culture really is found in the stories, the traditions, and the myths of the stuff, just like the gal over at the Troy store that gave a refund for those boots. The boots never were sold. They said, you did a fabulous job. You took care of the customer, and the customer is now a loyal Nordstrom's customer. That's a story, and it's a tradition inside Nordstrom that you always do what the customer says, and you'll get positive benefits from that. That's part of the culture. Pay attention and learn the culture before you try to change it. If you try to change it, make certain you don't violate the norms of the culture unless you really find it bad, because, or it could be the same thing as my former chancellor. She was on the outside looking in. You have two different kinds of organizations. You have the formal one, and you're going to find the formal one really on your organization chart inside the organization. Who was in charge of what and everything else. You also have this informal organization. I tend to call that the grapevine. The grapevine is that informal organization where people whisper nonstop behind the scenes. You can do a couple things. You can try to kill the grapevine. And some people do says, I'm going to have the newsletter, and the newsletter is going to be the source of all truth. Enough of this whispering and gossip. You almost are not going to get rid of the whispering and gossip because people are human and they're going to do it no matter what you do or say. You can also use it in a different way. I was a director of operations for a 5-college district, and I had to go back and do an internal audit on somebody. I really had one of the 5 colleges we had. I sat down there and I was really kind of frustrated. And so what I did is I went over and I told somebody, I said, okay, whatever I say, you just nod your head. I went and I went on the other side of the cubicle to the person that I called the head grape. I says, you know what? I'm just sick and tired of that college. And I named the college. I said, I'm going to go over there tomorrow at the end of the day and do an audit. I'm going to audit the following three things in their books. And if they have a problem, I'm going to start firing people. I'm done. I'm going to do formal disciplinary action, and things are going to pop whether they like it or not. That was first thing in the morning. And miraculously, I didn't go over for 3 days. When I went over eventually, I never even did my audit. I never did anything wrong. And all the problems disappeared because my informal organization, I used the head grape, and that head grape sat down there and whispered to that organization. They cleaned it all up. I got to do exactly what I wanted to do. They did what I wanted to happen using the informal organization. Yes, that's clever. It's called experience from being burned too often by sitting trying to fight the culture. Sometimes you have the culture fight for you what you want to have happen. So pay attention, learn your organization, learn the culture. You have an informal system, it's unstructured, it's emotional. Sometimes you can use that. And yes, the book speaks against it. I think you should use it. It just depends who you are. Have fun in the process. People always will sit down and talk to each other, so use that for a positive thing. Use it to build the culture. Use it to sit down and build a really good, solid relationship with the employees in it as well. One problem is always be careful about the social interactions, because sometimes you may have this person as a friend and you may have to do some formal disciplinary action, and that's always tough to do. So always make certain that you have a relationship where you can always sit down and act as a boss when you need to. So a couple things in change: know the formal organization, know the informal organization, know about inverted organizations, traditional ones, core competencies, and the concept of benchmarking to look at your organization to see how you can effect change in the way that you want it to happen. Take care.